Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let no jailhouse turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let no jailhouse turn me around. Gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let no police turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let no police turn me around. Gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let no injustice turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let no injustice turn me around. Gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land.
I welcome all of you on this Juneteenth Day. I'd like to introduce Reverend Louis Chase. He works with one of our founders, Dr. Jim Lawson, who was with Martin Luther King. He's a retired elder of the United Methodist Church and the Agenda for Prophetic Faith. And he's also on the board of ICUJP, and he will introduce our speaker. Reverend Chase?
Good morning.
Good morning
to all. Happy Juneteenth, and I say greetings in the key of hope. I am really delighted that Franz Exumé agreed to be our speaker this morning, and I'm not going to say much about him because it is already in your agenda. But for your understanding of him, you need to know that he really comes out of Los Angeles in large measure, although he lived in Claremont. Franz Exumé was a member of the Theology Reflection Group of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was under the executorship of Mark Ridley Thomas, and Jim Lawson was also the chairman. So he is one who is committed to nonviolence. Franz, I have known for many years. I'm not going to date us, but he is, in my view, a leading theologian. He comes out of a prophetic and progressive tradition in the Church of God in Christ. And I'm not sure that we have many persons of the Church of Christ that are associated with ICUJP. But I'm delighted that the fervor he has and that is being I would say probably of the Pentecostal tradition. They do strange things in church, like dance and have fun and praise the Lord. So I'm very glad that he is with us this morning. Of all the things that matter are not the things that are academic. There are things that are simply emotional. And I call Franz a friend. And in fact, not simply a friend, but a brother. I also have to really say something about a Dr. Eric Williams, who is going to do an epilogue. He is a distinguished teacher, and you also have information about him. He attended the University of Illinois at Chicago and underwent theological studies at McCormick Theological Seminary. And I think that they're all good schools, and it was only last week that I was in conversation with the dean of McCormick. So I would say Franz is going to present to us something about Juneteenth. And knowing his abilities, I'm convinced that it'll be thorough, detailed, and that it will point us to the future work that we have to do in ICUJP and perhaps throughout this country. Franz, please come forward.
Thank you so very much. Good morning. Thank you, Louis, for your kind and generous introduction. I thank ICUJP and its board, members, and family for this blessing and opportunity to speak. I've known of your fine work over the years in challenging our churches, communities, and nations to pursue peace and justice. And I very much appreciate that and feel spiritually connected to your work over the years. So I salute you. I also want to thank my loved ones, family, and friends that have tuned in to be part of our celebration of Juneteenth and our conversation this morning. I very much value your love, support, and tolerance through the years. The presentation is entitled Juneteenth and the Soul of America. I say it with a sad sense of the disparity between us. I'm not inclined within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions, whose chains, heavy and grievous today, are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilee shouts that reach them. These words from Frederick Douglass, a formerly enslaved person, were delivered on July 5th, 1852, at an Independence Day celebration and asked, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" This transports us to the crux of our observation of Juneteenth. It speaks to the divided nation, where brothers and sisters in God's family are set one against another, and the deplorable in our worst imaginings becomes real. It challenges in clear prophetic terms the premises of our National Independence Day and points toward the hopes and the aspirations for Juneteenth, the reconstruction of an alternate vision and reality. Juneteenth has been widely recognized by African Americans and the nation as a whole as a celebration of Black American emancipation from slavery in 1865. Though initially celebrated in Texas as Independence Day for African Americans, a tacit challenge to the legitimacy of the 4th of July Independence Day, which was roundly critiqued by Frederick Douglass in a celebrated speech, Juneteenth became a national cry for freedom and equality in America, a cry which bursts from the bosoms of African Americans that have been and continue to be treated less than. While Juneteenth is seen in an historic light, conditions and problems that existed then in post-Civil War America, when the observance was initially sacralized, continue undeterred. These issues center on the dehumanization of Black life, and more pointedly the Black male, and the deterioration of the American dream and flag under which an entire nation huddles. Moreover, this pernicious evil not only affects African Americans, but every other constituency that has worn the label of other. This corrosive maleficence affects and inflicts harm on men and women of color, the immigrant, and those maligned and defined by sexual orientation and health status. America has witnessed these conditions of dehumanization throughout its history to the present time. From the brief honeymoon and experiment of Reconstruction to the post-Civil War pogroms, the Jim Crow era, and the codified racial segregation, the public policy and practice these times have defined the contours of life, suffering, and death for African Americans. In the meantime, the fascination and obsession with Black male as a trope and justification for horrendous evils continues unabated, as is evidenced in every segment and sector of American life. Current events reveal the malaise afflicting the very soul of America. The recent killings of young Black men and women from Los Angeles and Ferguson and Sanford and Brunswick, Minneapolis, New York, and points in between tell more about us and the state of the nation than any other sociographic metric or barometer. These killings follow a long-standing tradition of lynchings, disappearances, beatings, and physical, cultural, and emotional castrations that are synonymous with America. These acts of police and mob violence that take place on the streets of our nation are compounded by the conspiratorial convergence of corporate greed and a government that is destined to do its bidding, while playing to the base reflexive instincts of the larger white population. What is an unavoidable reality in America is that the killing and denial of Black life are systemic and layered. What eventuated in the taking of lives of Trayvon Martin, George Floyd, and others are preceded by a predatory system of policing, law enforcement, and social control that pipelines young Blacks from inadequate schools to overcrowded prisons, a healthcare system that is inequitable, a legal system that counts convictions and forced pleas as substitutes for due process and justice, disenfranchisement of Blacks through gerrymandering and voter suppression, redlining for mortgage and the availability of affordable housing. All the while, there's a persistent and constant media portrayal of young Black males as a contorted depiction that equates it with criminality, hypersexuality, wanton violence, thuggishness, and an aversion to work and intellectual enlightenment. This is in marked contrast, by the way, to the self-assessment of Black life that Nina Simone sings about in her song To Be Young, Gifted, and Black. While the more prevailing motif in the country has been to devalue, deny, and suffocate Black life and aspirations, there has been a witness, a prophetic voice, a cry in the wilderness that says no to this dehumanization and yes to life. The faith traditions of Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and Buddhism, as represented in this esteemed organization, have at their best asserted a resounding affirmation in this American context to the inestimable worth of Black life. While the predominant system says no to Black life, these faith traditions say yes to life. This was true in the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s, the 1900s, and still today. To many celebrants, Juneteenth is a time of conviviality, family and community gathering, picnics, barbecues, outdoor performances and festivities featuring red food and drink. But what does all this have to do with Juneteenth? What does Juneteenth mean to us as Americans? How are we informed and challenged by this celebration? This presentation seeks to offer the Juneteenth celebration as an occasion for witness, protest, and hope. It also seeks to galvanize communities of faith and people of conscience with additional insight in the celebration as a clarion call to change and the possibility for America and the world to be just, equitable, and participatory. The first section of this presentation will provide an overview of the Emancipation Proclamations, the history of Juneteenth, and how it became a nationally observed celebration. The second part of the presentation looks at the prevailing conditions and challenges that have been constant throughout the country's history, from slavery to the present as relate to Black life and death. The third section looks at the function of Juneteenth as an ethical construct. And so what does Juneteenth have to tell us about our fight for justice, freedom, and equality? Contrary to popular belief, there are more than one proclamations of emancipation. A number of states had already abolished slavery prior to the Civil War. Pennsylvania had become the first state to abolish slavery in 1780. Massachusetts followed in 1783 and New York in 1827. States were in fact defined on the basis of whether they would allow slavery or not. So some states were known as slave states and others as non-slave states. Slavery was practiced primarily in the southern states such as Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, Arkansas, and others. In the strategy to win the Civil War, Lincoln abolished slavery as a tactic to disrupt the economies of the southern states and cause crippling disruption in their economy and way of life. Lincoln also offered formerly enslaved the ability to join the Union Army, another threat to southern states that fed into their worst fears of a deadly insurrection of Blacks. So heavily tied to Lincoln's Civil War campaigns, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862, on the heels of a military success in Antietam, declaring all slaves free in rebel states as of January 1, 1863. Freedom was in the air in Washington, D.C., but not for moral and ethical reasons. On April 16, 1862, Lincoln and the Congress ended slavery in D.C. through the D.C. Compensated Emancipation Act, which reimbursed those who had legally owned them and offered newly freed men and women, money to migrate. Now, where they should migrate or immigrate is another matter. On July 1862, Lincoln tested out the Emancipation Proclamation with the cabinet. Then, on September, 2 months later, issued a proclamation that freed those enslaved in Confederate states. The first section of the proclamation reads, "To all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of the state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then thenceforward and forever free. The executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons and will do no act or acts to repress such persons or any of them in any efforts they may make for their actual freedom." The proclamation was not across the board and universal. It only applied to states in rebellion and not the enslaved people in border states like Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland, which had not joined the Confederacy. Union soldiers read the proclamation as they traveled on plantations in cities and towns in southern states, which triggered large numbers of Blacks running to Union soldiers for protection and transport. Where they were to go was an entirely different matter. We have the voice of Mrs. Laura Smiley, a former enslaved woman that was interviewed in 1941 by the Federal Writers Project of the Works Progress Administration.
Do you remember any of the slaves being sold? Do you remember any slave sellers? You know, men that would just buy and sell. So.
No, so I never did see it. I should have never did know that, you know. We had talk of it, but then I read that was after slavery, I read. You didn't talk of it. You see them talk about, you know, putting them on stumps, you know, or something high, you know, and beating them off like they did cattle. Beat them off like they did cattle.
Oops. You know, I'm sorry. Is that the correct one?
That's fine.
Oh, okay.
That's fine.
Maybe I'm looking at the wrong place and it didn't look like it was matching. Sorry, I'll keep going.
No
Okay.
problem. On December 31.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Okay.
You were born right there, never did leave.
You were born right there and stayed there until I was about 9, 10 years old, maybe more. Stayed right there. We didn't know where to go. Mom and them didn't know where to go. You see, after funeral, just like you turn something out, you know, didn't know where to go. They just where to stay. Didn't know where to go. So it's all just like, you know, you turn out cattle. I say.
On December 31st, 1862, African Americans instituted a watch night service as they waited for the emancipation to go into effect. Watch night is now a common event in African American churches, where celebrants hold church service before midnight to pray in the new year. The Civil War ended on April 9, 1865. Then, on June 19, 1865, 2 months and 10 days after the end of the Civil War, and 2.5 years after the signing of the proclamation, Union soldiers went to Galveston, Texas, and read a general order. Not the Emancipation Proclamation, but a general order based on the Emancipation Proclamation. And the order reads, "The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and to work for wages. They're informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere." Signed by Commanding Major General Granger. Although the Emancipation Proclamation had freed enslaved blacks almost 2.5 years prior to the end of the Civil War, Texas was the most remote of the slave states, with low presence of Union troops, so enforcement of the proclamation had been slow and inconsistent. Later that year, December 6, 1865, the 13th Amendment passed, and formally abolishing slavery by amending the Constitution. On June 19, 1866, the first celebration in Galveston, Texas took place commemorating this emancipation. In fact, it was called Emancipation Day and later became Juneteenth. These celebrations grew in number of participants and formality of celebration to include prayer service, speakers with inspirational messages, reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, stories from former slaves, food, barbecue, red soda water, games, rodeos, and dances. What started out as a Texas celebration became more widespread. Initially, the celebration spread regionally to Louisiana, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. Then Juneteenth took on a national character as it gained more popularity, and African Americans' families migrated to the Northeast, Midwest, and Western parts of the United States. This migratory pattern took place at various intervals following the Civil War and at other times, particularly following World War II. State Independence Day celebrations were still observed in some states. However, Juneteenth became the national holiday of consensus. In fact, 46 states now recognize Juneteenth as a holiday. Many people wonder what happened between January 1, 1863 and June 19, 1865. What took so long? Well, the Civil War was on. The country was still in a state of war. Even in areas where Union troops were in control, getting proclamations and rules from Washington enforced were difficult at best. Also, there were intensified efforts on the part of enslavers to hide their enslaved in territories where the Union troops were less prevalent. In addition to this, the proclamation did not make it so. Practical questions such as where would one go? Or who would tell master his Negroes are free? What challenges and roadblocks would one encounter in leaving the plantation and finding a road to freedom? The release of blacks frequently came from the barrel of the Union guns. And we hear again from Mrs. Smalley.
Do you remember when the Civil War was being fought?
Well, I can't remember much about it, but I remember this much. When Mr. Bethany was gone a long time, looked like a long time. And I remember the next morning, when he got up, now don't talk to me. When we all got up and all of them went to the house to see old master. And I thought old master was dead, but he had been off to the war and come back. But then I didn't know, into the war. I just knew it was gone a long time. All the niggas gathered around to see old master again. And old master didn't tell it was free.
He didn't tell you that?
No, he didn't tell. They waited. I think now they said they wait them 6 months out of that. 6 months. And turn them loose on the 19th of June. That's why you celebrate that day, colored folks. Celebrate that day. Celebrate that day. Anyway.
Do you remember when the Civil War was being?
Thank you. None of the celebrants were under the illusion that the Emancipation Proclamation and the subsequent amendment were an actual declaration of freedom and full citizenship. To be clear, it was progress and better than the whip and the chain, but not full enfranchisement. It was viewed more so as a down payment on a promise yet to be fulfilled. Juneteenth was and is an occasion for coming together as a community to celebrate what God has wrought thus far and to acknowledge the sacrifices, lost lives, suffering of those that had lived in hope of a better tomorrow, in hope of freedom's sweet sound. The late Bishop and theologian Ithiel Clemens of the Church of God in Christ, the largest Black Pentecostal denomination in the United States, says, celebrations provide opportunities to re-examine the power, influences, strengths, and weaknesses of the original vision in light of history. They give a new generation the opportunity to reflect upon who and why they are, and to make a decision about their commitment to carry forward with that vision. Juneteenth offers this very type of occasion. And so on one level, there is merriment, barbecues, picnics, music, and parades, and other forms of celebration with red soda water, homemade muscadine wine, and gin. Yet on another level, there's a profound spiritual encounter with the ancestors and the vision the community yet has for itself, the country, and the world. It finds as its core an existential moment and hope that transcend the current circumstances, no matter what it seems. But what did freedom taste like? What was the intention and basis for this Declaration of Emancipation? What was slavery like? The General Order read by Granger casts the definition of freedom in economic terms. The proclamation gave a salute to personal and property rights, but discussed the abolition of slavery and the reorganization of work relations between the formerly enslaved and the erstwhile enslaver. It also went on to admonish the freedmen and women about idleness and essentially that there is no free lunch. Clearly, Lincoln's intention in declaring the emancipation was a tactical maneuver. He states in a letter dated August 22nd, 1862, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." Reparations for previous injustices should be the option of a human being that was wronged and injured. This was brought up, but never came to fruition. On January 16, 1865, Union General William T. Sherman issued his special field order, which was to redistribute the roughly 400,000 acres of land confiscated from Southern planters to newly freed Black families in 40-acre segments. This never happened. Reconstruction lasted from 1865 to 1877 and made efforts to redress the inequities of slavery and its political, social, and economic legacy. However, these efforts were quickly derailed and abandoned. During these years, Blacks enjoyed civil liberties in the South and were able to vote, with some holding elective office at various levels. This period, however, was short-lived with the rise of the KKK, voter intimidation, public lynchings as spectacle, church burnings, and attacks on Black communities. Blacks were driven from southern states out of fear and violence to other parts of the United States, such as the industrialized Northeast, Midwest, and West. My maternal grandmother was pregnant with her first son, and my grandfather, they were part of these great migrations. They fled Selma, Alabama in 1817, stopped in Louisville, Kentucky to give birth, then continued on to Cleveland, Ohio, where they settled. I would venture that every African-American family has a story of forced migration. What made this terrible circumstance palatable for many migrants, in addition to the amelioration of racialized violence, primarily directed at the Black male, was a hope of finding a better tomorrow, with jobs on the other end of the migratory trail. They migrated from fear and violence, which was known, to a future that was unknown, and a tremendous act of faith and courage, which is currently reflected in the migration stories of immigrants we currently see on our borders and in our detention centers. For the next years, the country witnessed a dramatic increase in this type of violence, including race riots and other attacks. The race riots, one of which occurred in Tulsa, Oklahoma from May 31 to June 1 on 1921, on the eve of Juneteenth, scorched Greenwood District. An estimated 150 to 300 people were killed. Scores of businesses and homes were burned, and the hopes of the Black community that was making economic progress were dashed in the ash heap that remained. Some scholars argue that the United States engaged then and now in genocidal practice against Blacks. The disparity in Black life and death in comparison to the norms speaks volumes about structural and institutional intent. Black incarceration rate is at 37% of the prison population, yet Blacks are only 12% of the overall population. We see similar divergences in mortality, employment, poverty, and literacy rates when compared to the national average. The problem Lincoln and others at the time faced was what to do with 4 million Blacks now that they were no longer needed to pick cotton and produce. The fact that our President 45 selected Tulsa, Oklahoma as a site for a major campaign rally on Juneteenth is not lost on his base, nor the country at large. After critical reaction to this blatant insult to African Americans and the nation as a whole, President 45 acquiesced and moved the rally to June 19th, one day over. The selection of Tulsa on this date and this time clearly demarks the territory and racializes his election in terms that could be no clearer. One consistent theme that recurs in the history of America from 1619 to the present is a devaluation of Black life. The Blacks had lived in colonies prior to 1619, and historians and archaeologists confirm a pre-Columbian African presence in the Americas. There has been a consistent and concerted effort to circumscribe, delimit, deny, and devalue Black life. In June 1619, a group of Africans were exchanged on the high sea for food provisions en route to Jamestown, Virginia. Subsequent to their settlement, slavery emerged as an economic choice for agricultural production. As the need for agricultural products increased, so did the economy's need for labor and its dependence on slave labor. The commodification of Black life was clearly a price the country was willing to pay, with its soul in the balance. Black life was bought, sold, auctioned, assayed, insured, cultivated like chattel, and disposed of when it proved to be of no use, problematic, uppity, or challenging. As early as 1787 in the Constitutional Convention, it was determined that Black vote, and by extension life, would be counted as 3/5 of that of whites. Though this 3/5 compromise, as it was called, was for legislative and tax purposes, it codifies and gives voice to the prevailing view of Black life's worth. And so the mistreatment of Blacks was justified as Blacks were seen as subhuman, an aberration of nature. While the 3/5 compromise quantified the value of Black life, the Dred Scott decision of 1857 qualified the value of Black life and rights. In this landmark case, the Supreme Court determined that Blacks had no rights that the white man was bound to respect. Let's hear what this means in practical terms. Here are the words of Mr. Charles Washington, who served in the 47th contingent. He was 89 years old in 1905 when he testified to a special examiner with the Bureau of Pensions. Charles Washington had been a slave for nearly half a century before freedom came. And he says, "I was born in the state of Florida and lived there until I was quite a lad of a boy. And then I was sold to a man by the name of Thompson, who sold me to a man by the name of Randolph. And was then put into a trader's yard in New Orleans, Louisiana. And there a man by the name of Dr. Vincent, who lived on Joe's Bayou. And he owned me for a long time until I was a grown man and had a wife and 3 children. Then Dr. Vincent sold me to Mr. James Berry, who lived on the Mississippi River. After I left home to go into the army, Mr. Berry carried all of his slaves who had remained at home to the state of Texas, and I've never heard of any of them. I was a married man and had 3 children, and he carried them to Texas, and I've never heard from them since." According to historians Donald Schaefer and Elizabeth Rogerson, the removal of slaves to Confederate states more remote from the war, like Texas, was not unusual. Planters in the Mississippi Valley forcibly removed as many as 150,000 slaves into Georgia and Alabama, as well as Texas, to prevent their liberation by Union forces. Mrs. Laura Smalley also has more to tell us about this.
Tend to all the children. Tend to the children. Just like, you bring a whole lot of children, and put them down, in one house. But somebody have to look over them, and tend to them that way. That's a house full of little children. And if you want to act bad, they'd whoop you. They'd whoop you too, the old woman. And if the old woman didn't tend to the children, they'd whoop her too. To make her tend to the children, she wasn't doing nothing. But she wasn't a crippled woman like me, She wasn't no crippled woman satisfied. She wasn't no crippled woman like me. And they'd whoop her. And they had trays. I don't know where you see the tray. Wooden tray, dug out, all about that long. And all of them, would get around that tray with spoons and just eat. I read like that because I ate out of the tray. With spoons, and eat, such like mush or soup or something like that. Would feed them, before 12 o'clock. And all them children get around there and just eat out of there. And that old woman, she would tend to her. Her name Aunt Tisha. Yeah, I know it. Old woman, name Aunt Tisha. And
Just like slopping hogs.
Just like a tray, just like a tray, you have. It's made just like a hog trough, In all the children.
Blacks were used by the planters in the South and in the meat-packing houses and industry in the Midwest and North. Black women were used to nurse white babies, cook and nourish white homes, plant and feed and comfort white fears. Blacks were used by Lincoln as a chess piece in a war game. Blacks' lives were then used as cannon fodder in the Civil War, in the westward expansion of the 1800s, in the Vietnam War, in Desert Storm and Desert Shield. Black lives are used to build the White House and the vast financial empires on Wall Street and Main Street that still dominate the American economy and culture. Black lives are used as experimental subjects to serve, to entertain in sports, music, and theater, and create great swaths of American culture. Black lives are used as an object to vent white frustration and ease the conscience of whites for the sin of racism. And so the lynchings became a way of purging white conscience of its guilt, of silencing and obliterating the very object of its scorn. The blood spilled on the cotton fields and in the streets of America today cry out to God for justice. Just as Abel's blood cried out in Genesis, so too is black blood crying out in this revelation of God's justice. The jazz trumpet in its sinewy discourse with no words speaks volumes about the trouble we have seen. The trumpet becomes a way of quieting the fears and appropriates the transcendent tonality of Gabriel's horn in seeking God's judgment for this pernicious evil. Juneteenth is just seen as an ethical construct, one that addresses where we are as a nation and where we ought to be. It is grounded in a particular historical circumstance, yet reaches into the present with authoritative clarity. While the celebrants of Juneteenth were not particularly literate, they understood the text and subtext of the Emancipation Proclamation and the general orders issued by the commanding generals in the wake of the Civil War. The celebrants of Juneteenth read and discerned the times, the competing trends, and historicity of the moment. They also understood God's movement in the moment and that they had an appointment with destiny, as Martin King once said. Juneteenth celebration on one level is commemorating the act of emancipation. It says we have shaken off the shackles of slavery and we're free from being owned by another human being. This is a momentous occasion, a time for mirth and merriment. Yet, on another level, Juneteenth is also a call that the promises of emancipation broaden to every aspect of one's life as a child of God. It recognizes our birthright of freedom and blessing from God. On this level, Juneteenth is a challenge to resume the work of freedom and not rest until we, and by extension, everyone is free. Juneteenth is also a witness to all that suffer the weight of being marginalized in this society. The palpable sense of being disregarded, dehumanized, hunted, and killed is known to others in this society. Juneteenth is a repudiation and rejection of the category of other. By categorizing a group of people as other, whites use themselves as a standard and benchmark by which all others are measured. The category of other calls the commodification of the neighbor and relieves the protagonist from ethical responsibility to treat others fairly and justly. By humanizing the other person or arguing that they have some moral, intellectual, or spiritual deficiency, it makes room for maltreatment of that person or group. Immigrants from Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, and South Asia fit into this category of other. Women are frequently labeled as other and not worth equal pay for equal work. LGBTQ people are considered other and worthy of derision and shame. Juneteenth is also a form of protest and resistance. The Blacks that celebrated Juneteenth on 1866 and later were clear about the ways in which emancipation was intended as a limited provision, which in some ways would be considered a cruel jest, as no provision was made to make them whole. The Emancipation Proclamation made no provisions for reparative or restorative justice. It made no space in the square of public discourse for a moment of truth and reconciliation. Blacks understood that by celebrating Juneteenth, it was a form of protest to the shortcomings of the proclamation and the continuing oppression they experienced. Juneteenth is also an affirmation of hope that truth crushed to the ground will rise up, that the God of tomorrow would make it right. It was a declaration that no matter what the dominant society conjures up to oppress us, it can be a prison industrial complex, be it the police shootings that declare open season on Black life, be it the gross disproportionality in health, education, mortality, and wealth, that there will be a redemptive day when justice will roll on like many waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing river. The beauty of Juneteenth is that at its core, it too seeks the redemption and reconstruction of white humanity. It believes that everyone can and should be treated as equals. It believes in the restoration of justice and righteousness. It believes that the cancer that eats away at the humanity of those that partake of racism can be cured, that whites can be made whole. Of particular importance are the voices of the faith community. Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and Buddhism have, when operating at their best, affirmed the inestimable worth of human life, that human life is sacred and to be respected, cherished, and affirmed. These faith traditions then and now continue to challenge the prevailing ethos of dehumanization in America. They raise the challenge to police brutality, environmental degradation of God's creation, to the meanness, violence, and callous disregard for the suffering of others. Juneteenth creates a space where life can be affirmed, where people of conscience can gather and celebrate Black history and achievement as a symbol of what is possible when we work together, and also a reminder that we're all still working for justice, peace, and an inclusive world. And I thank you, and at this time, we'd like an epilogue from Dr. Eric Williams.
Thank you very much, Reverend Exumé, for your very thoughtful presentation. I also found particularly moving to hear the voice of those who were actually, who experienced slavery. I found that to be particularly moving. And I mean, your presentation was so comprehensive. The few words that I'll say today is that I want to open my few comments today with a quote by Zora Neale Hurston. I think it was Brother Fernando who also lifted her up this morning. But there is a quote that she has that if you are silent about your pain, they will kill you and say you enjoyed it. I was thinking of, there's a historian by the name of Vincent Harding, a religious historian, who says that African-American history is a history that is written through tears. And so fundamentally, I think what Reverend Exumé lifts up today is this matter of Black pain. But it also points to this respite and this sign of hope, this moment to breathe in the ongoing quest for liberation and humanization of Black people here in the United States. I was thinking as he was speaking about James Baldwin and Ralph Ellison and this matter of Black invisibility. Ralph Ellison talks about the invisible man. James Baldwin, nobody knows, no name in the street, namelessness and invisibility. But there's also this matter of Black inaudibility. And because Blacks so often are not heard. I was just watching it was a case, one of the, a court scene around these conversations about police reform, where one Black congressman is trying to speak and he's just not heard. And this matter of Black inaudibility is a real matter, and hence Dr. King's notion of a riot being the language of the unheard, those who are systemically ignored, systemically muted, that they rise up. And I think that this is a moment, I think, for all of us, to see that a new world is trying to be born. And I think that this the nation's acknowledgement of Juneteenth in a more visible way, corporations and states and different institutions are beginning to acknowledge it in ways that I had not seen heretofore. I think that is just as Reverend Exumé was saying, that Juneteenth is the sign of this new world that wants to be born, and we want to do all we can to help push. So thank you very much, Reverend Exumé, for your very thoughtful presentation, and I look forward to hearing responses to what you shared today. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Franz, both of you, for all that you've shared. And so let's take this moment at this time. This has been just phenomenal information, and just be still for a moment before we have any questions. And also, if you would raise your hand in the, if you have a question, but I think you have given us so many answers right now that we just need to take just a moment